Hello, my name is Edward, and I have never believed that there are creatures similar to what many call dogmen, or what others know as werewolves. However, my opinion changed on the night of August 23rd, 2008. I'll never forget it. This is my experience. My wife and I were driving back to our cabin. This is in the northern woods, after visiting friends in town. This summer, it was very hot and muggy, but because of the time of night, it was cooling down quite fast, and it started to get foggy. The road went about a half-mile through spruce bog, then up a hill. There was a farm field that was on the right, more hardwoods on the left. I was in my mid-50s at the time, and did not believe in things like this that we were about to see. Out of the fog from the farm field, going right to left, came a creature. The creature was easily 8 to 10 feet tall. The best way to describe what we saw would be to say it looked like a person and a wolf mixed in one. It looked like a werewolf. This thing or person was covered in hair, upright, and had fur all over. Now it jumped up in the air, landing on its feet, directly in front of my wife's van, no more than 20 feet away. The craziest thing is, when it landed, it moved and glided. It was so graceful and so silent. It's like it was the perfect predator, and its arms were sticking straight out in front of it. I've never in my life seen a canine look or act like this, and we had been going very slowly due to the fog, but as soon as we both saw this thing, we stopped the van. We just both looked at each other like, did we really just see that? And we did. It still freaks us out to this day. Another weird thing is that we both felt it was not of this world. It didn't move naturally. Like I said, its movements were just so smooth and fluid. Like when it moved, it kind of glided. But that's just the feeling we got. My wife has never been able to speak about this, especially what happened and afterwards. We're very hesitant to tell many people about what we saw. We don't want to get told we're fools. However, I did tell a good friend of mine, who didn't laugh. He said when he was little, his dad was a logger and would tell him all the times about seeing a dogman. I'm so glad I found your channel. I see that other people have similar creatures like this one. It must be difficult for some of these people to talk about what they saw and try and explain to others what they saw. I hope this helps. Here in Michigan, there's a lot of dogman sightings. I'm a believer. You don't have to convince me. But one sighting I wanted to share with you was back in 2015, where a guy and his girlfriend were driving down the street. She had just got out of work, and it was late at night. She looks over to her left and sees something bolt from behind one house to another. What was weird about it is that the thing bolted across the road in a very strange way. In a way that at first made the guy and the girl both think it was a cougar. However, what caught their eye was not its movement or color, but its height and size. Once they saw that, they fully realized this was no cougar, as they could see from their perspective just how fast and how large it really was. It didn't move like any normal feline or any normal animal would. This both freaked them out pretty bad, so they decided to go get some food and maybe talk about it and hope calm down after that. And as they're driving away, they see it just standing there, under a street lamp, staring them down as they drove past slowly. He described what he saw that night as being very dark in color, with a wolf head on a man's body. The girlfriend described it in the exact same way. For nearly 6 months, I and 3 of my buddies had been camping out in the woods. We were all about 20 at the time. This was also in Ohio. We had constructed a small lean-to and would spend weekends there. The location was all about 30 minutes away from our hometown. We knew of it because we used to hunt there when we were much younger. The last weekend in October, I think it actually might have been November. One of my friends wanted to go back to get some firewood. He grabbed his .22 rifle, headed out on his own around noon. About 2 or 3 hours later, he returned with an odd story. While pacing around near the creek that ran through the area, he heard movement. Looking up to see what he thought was an old man in a gray overcoat. But as the figure came closer, it was very clear this was no man. It had long white-gray fur covering its entire body. Its fingers were unusually long, ending in sharp claws, and the face was nothing more than 2 large black eyes, and that of a head of a wolf. A very long snout and pearl-white teeth. And it stood on 2 legs, like a human being, not like a 4-legged animal would. And upon seeing this bizarre moving thing silently moving through the underbrush, my friend, instead of panicking, shot at this thing and fled back to the lean-to, leaving his rifle behind. When he got back to camp, he thought that perhaps it was a bear, but realized this thing looked more like a wolf than anything else. And when he was telling me about it, I was kind of shocked by his reaction. I mean, this is a guy who never gets scared. He's been out in the woods tons of times, does not really react to anything. So to see him be so upset and to be reacting the way he did, this clearly had to have been something out of the ordinary to shake him up so badly. I mean, the man was freaked. I was driving home with my son after he had just got off work at 10 p.m. He worked pretty late, and after going through high school, he had just got his very first job with a close family friend and was working evenings. He was lucky if he got off at 10. So this night, I had picked him up and was driving him home. It was also in the summer. It had been very hot today. And for the record, we live in northern Kentucky, right beside a large farm. So at this point, we're a few miles away from the house, going down a very small hill towards an intersection. There's also a small window of trees that you can see through them enough to see if other cars are coming from either direction. This is also right before you get to the intersection itself. At this point, I didn't see if there's any other traffic at all, so I had a green light and began making my way through the intersection. But something caught my son's and I's attention off the right side of us. Almost directly behind some trees that were obscuring our vision was what could be, because it was dark outside. It seemed to be a humanoid figure, and at first, I thought it was a person trying to flag us down, dressed up in all black, but something about the head and the hair that kind of stuck out to me. I saw what appeared to be pointed ears, kind of like a Doberman pinscher, or so that's what it reminded me of. And I realized shortly after we got closer to this was no human, because whatever this was immediately took off running diagonally across the road in front of us, so quickly that I could barely catch what was happening if I was not looking directly ahead. My son and I both saw this thing, and to our amazement, gasped. And my son just kept asking, "Dad, what is that thing?" "I don't know, son." It looked like a large crooked canine or something. I say crooked because the way it kind of leaned over and bent itself, like it was deformed or its spine was bent. It was inhumanly fast, and the structure did resemble that of a canine when it came to the head. But the body was something else. Being in Kentucky, you hear all sorts of stuff, and I've heard of the term Dogman before. People say it's synonymous with a werewolf, but I don't think this was a werewolf. This just looked like some sort of really large dog. Could it have been a Dogman? Very possibly so. I've heard there are a lot of accounts out here in Kentucky, and the whole South too, even ranging down to Mississippi. I guess when I saw that thing for the first time, I was so flabbergasted that I wasn't exactly sure what we were looking at. And it ran across the road so quickly, we didn't even have time, my son and I, to process it, let alone slam on our brakes to stop for this thing. I will say it was pretty long and pretty dark, but it never looked over at our vehicle, just kind of was trying to get out of field of view, or so I sensed. Here's my story with a Dogman. My stepdad's friend owns some land in Titusville, Louisiana. He does a lot of hunting on his land and has had some strange incidents with animals there. One day, while out on his four-wheeler, checking up on one of his deer stands, he came across an extremely large bipedal canid that was darker than the blackest nights you could ever imagine. It appeared to be covered in hair or fur and was shorter than any dog he had ever seen. This thing was easily maybe 4'5", 4'6", but he also claims that it was very, very hunched over. But when it rose to its feet, it was much taller. Now it growled at him and snarled before running off to the dense woods, almost kind of seeming agitated to see him. The only thing close to this creature is what the old legends depict as a werewolf or a rougarou, huge and covered in hair. But at the end of the day, it's just an animal. Who knows exactly what this thing was? Probably some strange creature, that's for sure. Louisiana is surely not lacking in strange sightings of monsters, ghosts, and even giants. It is the voodoo capital, and it has more than one place to come to mind when you think about something spooky or unusual happening. This state is also home to the infamous Honey Island swamp monster, who, some say, is actually a Bigfoot, while others say it's a swamp monster. Swamp creatures are not the only mystery around here either. There are haunted houses, abandoned plantations, cities with lost histories around every corner waiting to be discovered. So, you never know. It wouldn't really surprise me if there really was a Dogman or a werewolf living around. I'm pretty sure I saw a werewolf when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I was walking home from school. I live in Louisiana, and around my way, there are some deep woods where you can get lost if you're not paying attention. It's pretty hot down here, so the kids would do anything to get out of being inside. And my friends and I would play outside all day. We loved the humidity. This one time, I'm walking back from riding bikes with a few friends when I hear this noise off in the distance. It sounded like somebody was coughing up, but it sounded different, and it made me uneasy. At first, I did my best to ignore it, until I got close enough to hear what the noise was really coming from. That's when I began running, right? Well, apparently, some large creature had begun coming after me. And although I didn't see it at first, I could just sense it, so I began running as fast as I could. And at first, I thought it was my own paranoia, but I started running faster and faster and faster. And the next thing I know, I'm jumping over a metal fence, and now I could hear something actually behind me running. But when I turned to look, the thing that I saw blew me away. It was real. Whatever this was a living werewolf, in the flesh. Long black fur draping down, very wild and unkempt looking, and was viciously chasing after me. Now, what's weird about this is the people who I tell this story to don't believe me. In fact, I'm pretty much mocked for it. But this is the only time where my gut instinct acted, because I feel, looking back, that this thing was preying upon me, and it was watching me already through the tree line. I could just sense there was something coming, and so I just started running. I've never acted this way or done this in my life, except for this one time. Normally, my body and I would never do such a thing. But this was different. After I jumped over the metal fence, which was quite a feat because I was a pretty out-of-shape kid, so I must have been scared, I tumbled over and fell on the other side of the fence, pulling myself back up, and I could see this thing running right up to the fence. But instead of jumping over, it just stood there and gave me this look like, yeah, you better run. And it kind of was pissed and nodded its head, and then jumped to the side where the trees are. Which now, if you go a little further ways, the fence ends. So my first thought, after seeing this, was this thing is going to go around and try to flank me from the trees. So I kept running further and further, and I threw my backpack down so I could go a little faster. And then I could hear this thing again. It was doing exactly what I feared it would do. It was going to flank me. I could hear it coming off and breaking through all the bramble and bushes to my right, coming at me at a 90-degree angle. And if I didn't act fast, I would soon be dog food. But my house was just right up the street. So very quickly thinking, I pulled out my textbook that was on my backpack on the ground in which I just dropped and got ready to chuck it at this thing. But right as I did that, and lifted the book above my head, ready to throw this at this thing to stop it. I mean, I was at the brink of fear. What else was I supposed to do? I had no other means of self-defense. This was all I had. It stopped. Whatever it was, just sat there in the woodline and stopped. I could hear it breathing, very slowly, very heavily. These long-winded, raspy breaths. It was waiting for me. It wanted me. I was trembling with fear, expecting to be taken out any moment. I had no idea what was going to come. So I stood there and held my ground for probably another 30 seconds. And then, as this thing began pausing, I couldn't hear it breathing anymore. I began to hear more movement next to it, and to the left of it. My only understanding in that moment was that more of these things were approaching next to it, and they were all getting ready to jump me. And I think in that moment, they began to move closer to me, because I could see the trees start swaying back and forth as they were approaching closer. I just dropped the book and I did not care. I ran. And as soon as I made it to the street, which borders the forest and swamps, I didn't hear him anymore, and I just sprinted the rest of the half block down to my house, running in, locking the door. And my lungs and entire body burned like I had just ran a marathon. My mother was home, and she was wondering what on earth was I running from. I explained to her I saw a really big dog, and it was going to eat me. She kind of half laughed, half looked concerned, but explained to me, "Honey, it's okay. There are no big dogs that are going to attack you." But I just ran up to my room, and I cried for quite a while. And after that day, I did not play in the swamps as much anymore, especially not after school. It was just too risky, not knowing that one of these creatures were around. As I got a little older, I understood that this was what they call a dogman, or some people call a rougarou, or I guess you can call it a werewolf. Either way, you want to look at it. This thing is a real-life living legend. It's alive. I know. I saw it face to face, and it's more meaner and nastier than you can imagine in person. I think had this thing caught up to me, I would have never made it home that day. I'm just glad I outsmarted it. This evening, I was going for a nice stroll, or a jog. I had my phone on, and I had Spotify blaring in my ears. Life was good. As I was passing under a street lamp, I'd begin to notice something strange. Maybe the shadows behind and around me had begun moving, but maybe not. So I continued just fine. The loop I usually make around the neighborhood is about 2 miles. My neighborhood is nestled in Washington State. There's a lot of thick woods around here, but I never go in them. One time, I walked too close to one of the wooded areas, and I feel like I almost got jumped. There was a homeless dude in there who about broke my skull open with a beer bottle. I think he was already pretty drunk, and he harassed me. That was not a fun thing to run away from. But this night, there was no traffic really. No angry homeless man trying to kill me. And everything was pretty quiet. Just the crickets and the beautiful nightlife. But I couldn't really hear much because again, I had my earbuds in and I was blasting Spotify. So I'm walking, and I turn a curve. And up ahead in the distance, the road kind of bends a little bit and then turns again onto a main road. Now, on the right side, the street continues down towards more neighborhood. On the left, it does the same, but it's kind of through a very thick forest area. I'm looking and I just see these two small red glowing lights. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, those kind of look like glowing eyes. Ha, probably isn't though. And so I keep walking, and I'm pretty sucked into my music. You know how when you're walking down and you're sometimes listening to music, you're kind of just off in space. Well, I look back up, maybe about a few feet later, and I see those strange lights. They're still there. And now I'm thinking, does maybe somebody have a Halloween prop up? I mean, this is weird. But the closer I get, in the darkness, I can kind of now make out an outline. This shape or these lights, whatever they were from, were between two streetlights. So they were kind of well tucked into the darkness. But I'm walking closer and closer on the opposite side of the street on the sidewalk, and I'm looking over at it. And I can see that these lights are staying parallel, looking at me. And I'm squinting my eyes to try and adjust more to the light and see what I'm looking at. And I see these tall, perky ears, and that these lights are indeed eyes, and that it's on this large, woolly body. And it clicks in my head almost instantly. Ah, okay. This is a very elaborate Halloween prop. Awesome. And as I walk by it on the other end of the street, I kind of start smirking, because I'm thinking, man, somebody still has this thing up. That's impressive. And then all of that goes out the window when it begins to move. It kind of just very slowly backs away into the forest and disappears. That's when I almost had a double take and think to myself, what did I just see happen? And right then and there, the strangest feeling came over me. A feeling like I should go back now. I'm no longer safe. It was the heebie-jeebies, the worst case I've ever felt. And because there was nobody else around, I did not have the safety that I normally feel, where you get the hustle and bustle of the day, so if something were to happen, there's other people around. This was about 11:30 at night. See, where I work, at my grocery store, I get off pretty late, and I always like to go for a night walk before heading to bed. It kind of helps de-stem me, so this was just another Monday night. But after seeing that, whatever it was, it definitely spooked me. I probably went double the speed back home, and that was enough walking for a while. I probably didn't go on another night walk till the following Thursday or Friday. Fear eats me alive every time I sit back and contemplate on this, but you may not believe me. I once saw a 7-foot-tall Dogman cross the road right in front of my vehicle, casually sauntering across the road like it was taking an evening stroll. I had just jumped in my car, getting ready to go home from work, checking text messages on my phone, when I just happened to glance up due to the movement, and I see this thing stepping out on the road. I had a double take at first, and of course, I was in shock at seeing this thing. This massive bipedal canine just stepping out and taking about 3-4 quick steps and disappearing on the other side of the street. No, I did not have time to take a picture, but I did have time to see its glaring eyes, how they kind of glowed this warm orange amber color. I wasn't as terrified as I was just in total shock at seeing this thing. I don't think it saw me, or at least it didn't look at me. It kind of seemed like it was very intent on getting across the road quickly, as to not be seen. So in about 3 or 4 strides, boom, it was gone. The whole sighting lasted maybe no more than 5 seconds. It was very quick. And had I had my head down even more, my eyes probably would have not even caught the movement. I didn't even know what a Dogman was until this happened to me. I was with a couple of friends, and we were having a party, back in the fall of 2013. One of my friends had to opt out early, because they had to get up very early for work. We're talking like 4 a.m., and it's roughly about 9 p.m. at night. So we're all sitting around talking, they say their goodbyes, and they head out the door. Well, after he leaves, we're sitting there still chit-chatting, and then not even 30 seconds later, we hear pop, 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 slam. The door opens, and it's our friend. We all turn around in shock and see his expression. He is freaked out and panicking, hyperventilating. Guys, there's a freaking werewolf out here." We're all kind of like, "Wait, what?" And none of us really believe him. And one of us asks, "What are you talking about, Jonathan?" He comes in, slams the door, locks it, and begins really frantically looking out the window. "I think it's still out there. I don't know." Now we're all concerned, standing up, saying, "Dude, calm down. What happened? What did you see?" And he turns around and he is so pale. I thought the dude was going to puke. He tells us that as he was going out to his car, he sees this large dog stand up behind his car and step off behind the hedges. And Travis, the friend's house at which we were at, immediately gets worried, grabs his gun, and goes out there. He thinks it was an intruder, or maybe somebody wearing a costume wanting to case his house or something. So he steps out on the porch and screams, "Who's out here?" and fires off around into the sky. Now Jonathan, completely panic-stricken, is doing his best to try and get Travis back in the house. "Travis, it's out there, get back in now." But Travis is not having any of it. He steps out to where Jonathan's car is at, looking around to see if he can try and find a trace of anything. It's lightly raining, very quiet. There ain't really no trace of nothing out here. So he steps out further towards the end of the driveway, and immediately stops, off across the road, right there in the opening of the trees. He sees this tall bipedal figure, glowing amber eyes, and this massive head he described looked exactly like a German shepherd's, just staring at him, due to its close proximity of the streetlight. He got a pretty good look at this thing. Travis is just frozen there, and we could all see him from the window looking at something beyond the hedges. He stops, turns back at us, and begins running back to the house. He flies in the house, closes the door, locks it, and now his expression was just like Jonathan's. Pale, stuttering, and of course me and my other friend are freaking out now, but maybe half thinking this whole thing is an elaborate prank. He looks at Jonathan and says, "You need to stay the night, man. You're not safe out there." And Jonathan just keeps saying, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" So we kind of wait around for a while, expecting things to eventually die down. And Travis and Jonathan just sit there. He's still holding this rifle, and Jonathan is spooked. They even question calling the cops, but Travis shoots that down. "The cops are going to think we're crazy, dude. Don't even bother. We'll just wait it out and see what happens." And so about 2 hours goes by, and Jonathan's like, "I really need to go home and get some sleep." And he opens the door, and it is eerily quiet outside. Before, you could hear the crickets. They were pretty loud. I mean, they practically overtake the night. And now it is so silent, you could hear a pin drop from a mile away. Jonathan bolts to his car, jumps in, turns the ignition on, and he flies out of the driveway, stops, waves back at us, gives us the thumbs up, and speeds off. Travis is just standing there, looking out the window. Well, he obviously got out of here okay. "Alright, boys, time to hold down the fort tonight." Of course, me and my other friend are still pretty unnerved by everything that's gone on. Was this a prank? Did they really see something? The rest of the night was pretty weird. We ended up crashing out in his living room, probably closer to 1 a.m. Although I swore at one point in the middle of the night, I heard something tapping on the glass of the window, right where my head is. I kind of woke up, but I never dared open my eyes to see, just in case. I don't want to actually acknowledge that what happened was true, but maybe Travis and Jonathan really did see something. After the night, we never spoke about it again. In fact, the next morning, I think we were all pretty much ready for things to be back to normal. One night, my wife and I were just sitting out back in the backyard, on our trampoline, just laying there with a blanket, watching the stars cuddling. We were lost in conversation and at the magnificence of the universe above us, when my wife suddenly says, "Hun, what is that?" And I kind of look up to where she's pointing. We both see these tall, perky ears on the other side of our fence. I'm thinking, "Honey, I don't know what that is." And we're now both intently looking at whatever it is she's pointing at. Then, this head pops up over the fence line, and it's this grotesque-looking dog face staring at us. My wife screams, and then it ducks its head back down. We both get up and run inside, locking the sliding glass door. My wife just keeps saying, "What was that? What was that?" I have no idea, but I can tell you it was no dog, or anybody wearing a cheap mask. The fence is about 10 feet tall, so unless there's a giant behind the fence wearing a very elaborate Hollywood mask, then I have no idea what this was. I have a very large backyard. I don't say that to boast. I say that to set up the story, because one evening, a very calm evening, I was sitting at home on my computer, relaxing, sipping coffee, as coffee is one of those evening treats of mine that really helps me wind down. It was about the end of the day, and since I work from home and I stare at a computer screen all day long, I needed some mental de-stemming. So I left to go and sit out on my back porch, stare off into my backyard, where there's a creek in the distance, and watch the sun set. This is not only easy on the eyes, but it helps relax the brain as well, taking a break from being in my computer office all day. So I'm sitting out there, sipping on my coffee, and my eyes adjust to something, a dark shape. Right at the edge of my vision, I could see something huge and black running across in a straight line. This is right down by the creek. And then, pop, right to my left, I see this large buck running very fast. And right after it, not even a second later, is the largest dog I've ever seen in my life chasing after it. But it looked very strange, like it was deformed. Have you ever seen a hyena? It kind of reminded me of a very large hyena, with the very arched back. But its 4 front arms were very huge, and the head was massive. You know how a lion's head is kind of overly sized, like it's almost like it's too big for its body. That's how this dog reminded me, but it was definitely canine. I've never seen a large dog like that before ever. And it goes running after this buck, disappearing into the trees. It definitely spooked me. I mean, I don't know if that was a wolf or not, but I have never seen wolves that big in my life. My boyfriend and I rented out a cabin in Syracuse, in New York. Well, it was just outside of town, about an hour away, out in the woods. It was a very cute little cabin, very homesy, and very tucked away. At the time, my boyfriend was working a night shift job that he absolutely hated. I never got to see him a whole lot, while I tried to work all these odd-end jobs just to make ends meet. His boss was really screwing him over on hours, and while he was getting consistent shifts, he absolutely hated the shifts he worked. And this is where we would have several encounters that would change our perspective on wildlife as a whole. One evening, as I was coming home from work, as I pulled into the driveway, my headlights caught something right on the side of our house. It froze the second the headlights hit it, and I went into a state of panic and shock upon seeing this thing. It was fairly muscular, with the chest that was very human-like. The legs down were very muscly as well, and from the waist down, it reminded me very much of a dog, even having hocks, but the feet, I couldn't exactly tell what they were. I couldn't see any genitalia. From the chest, which was massive, it had large biceps and triceps, extending down to very long forearms, and huge overly sized hands with large fingers and claws at the end. Very reminiscent to a raccoon's hands, but more longer, if that makes sense. The head looked somewhat wolfish, but also had a large mane around the neck, the same way a lion does. The eyes were a piercing yellow, almost kind of set into its skull, and it kind of just stared at me, in the headlights, in shock, the same way I was in shock. It stood there for a second, then turned its head, and leapt off into the dark. I just sat there in the car, completely shocked at what I had just seen, and not quite sure how to process what animal I just saw. So I go get in the house, and my boyfriend is just now getting ready for work, and I'm unsure whether to tell him or not. So I decide to keep it to myself. I figured, why not ruin his evening? So I tried to hide my emotions the best I could, but it turns out about a week or so later, he would see the same animal on his way leaving work, about 4 in the morning. Like I said, his shifts would shift around constantly. Sometimes he'd have to leave at 3 or 4 in the morning. Other times he'd work from midnight till 8 a.m. His boss was a real you-know-what, and loved to just drag him around. But that's how bosses are sometimes. When my boyfriend saw it, he was going outside, smoking a cigarette, right as he was jumping in the car, and pulling out of the driveway, this thing jumps in front of the road and looks right at him. He too is shocked, halts on his brakes, so he doesn't hit whatever this thing is. It looks at him, and he would later tell me it kind of grimaces, then turns its head and leaps off into the trees. Not into the forest, but actually jumps up into the trees. This scares the living heck out of him, and he flies down the road. Gets to work about 20 minutes early. His boss thought he was so shooken up, he was convinced he had a couple of Red Bulls. Haha. He calls me on break and says, "Babe, you wouldn't believe what I just saw this morning." And so I ask him, "What did you see?" And he tells me, "It looked like a werewolf, but I don't know what it was." And so I kind of just told him the descriptions, and he agreed. "Yeah, how did you know?" he said. And I told him, "I saw the same thing last week, as I was coming home from work." Then we started speculating. What kind of animal is this thing? Does it live around here? Will it eat us? Apparently, it hasn't seemed to act aggressive towards us yet, so I'm going to assume that we were safe. Fortunately, we only saw it one other time, and that was it. No more encounters with the Wolfman. My job sometimes takes me to Kentucky, every now and again. So, this one time, back in 2016, I decided to stop overnight in Tennessee after my shift. I got a hotel room near Cookeville. It was about 1 a.m., and the next day was Saturday. I wouldn't be too early to check in. I didn't have any difficulty falling asleep that night, usually just watching TV and kind of zoning out on my phone. But something woke me up around 3 or so in the morning. At first, I couldn't remember where I was or why I'd woken up. But then, something began pounding on my door. It wasn't super loud, like, an axe murderer trying to chop down the door and bust in to say, "Here's Johnny." It was more like somebody with large claws or hands hitting the door, over and over again, with their palms, to try and catch my attention. I kept trying to remember where I was, but I couldn't recall having ever rented a hotel. It was like I was in this strange trance or a daze. I felt compelled to get up out of bed and go answer the door, when any normal sane person would have seen all the red flags here. But it was like this energy pulling me towards the door. That's the only way how I can describe it, really. And as I walked towards it, I opened the door and backed off a little bit right as I opened. There was nothing there, but the night outside was still. No crickets. It was silent. I very slowly peeped my head out. Nothing. I didn't see anything down either hallway. So as I pulled my head back out, and right as I grabbed hold of the door to get ready to slam it shut, something ran by the door very fast, and it looked like a large upright wolf. If you think that description's crazy, I can tell you what it wasn't. A man. This was not a prank. Whoever or whatever this was way too quick to be a human. I didn't stick around to try and find out exactly what it was. I felt like whatever trance or daze I was in was broken. I quickly grabbed my clothes and my laptop bag, jumped to my car, and drove away. I remember sitting there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. The waking up in a daze and something running past my door. After maybe an hour of sitting there on the road, I had gathered up enough courage to go back to my hotel room. None of my stuff was touched. The door was not broken into. Nothing. I swear this is 100% what happened. I have no idea what was going on. I don't know if this was some living nightmare or if what happened. It creeped me out though. One of our favorite rivers in 2015 during the springtime. It was like any other normal day. We got up early before dawn and packed a small backpack with some snacks, some food, some smokes, and a bottle of water. We made a quick stop at the store to pick up some slabs of fresh food for bait. When we arrived at our usual fishing spot, it was right around 7:30 a.m. The sky was just now getting brighter as daybreak had approached. Our usual fishing spot is located approximately 2 miles from the parking area, down an old gravel road. This road leads deep into the woods until it ends at a bank of river, going through much steeper terrain than you would think possible. My brother takes his pack off and says he's going to head upriver, about 100 or so yards. This is where you can get across without having to deal with the deep part of the river. I tell him I'm going downstream to hang out at a small beach. We had found one on one of our previous trips. I make it about halfway out, and I'm fishing and just enjoying life. And I happen to notice something in the middle of the trail, roughly 100 yards away from me. At first, I just think it's my brother messing with me. But when I yell his name and don't get a response, fear struck me like lightning. I realized this wasn't my brother. This was somebody else. Did my brother get into trouble? Why is this person just staring at me? And that's when I noticed its movement, as it began to kind of wade back and forth. This was not a human being at all, but a large animal, a bipedal one. And immediately, I felt frozen. I felt terrorized. I couldn't say a word, and it started to walk in this direction. But it almost moved kind of robotically. The way it moved its legs back and forth, I could feel panic had filled my entire body, and I could feel hate and malice on this thing coming towards me. I finally was able to snap out of my fear-induced coma, or so it felt, and I turned toward the direction where I thought my brother would be. This thing then lunged towards my direction, and cleared about 30 feet in one lunge. That was enough for me. I threw down my fishing line and I ran back to the direction that I knew the truck was in. And I could hear this thing on my trail coming up to me very quickly, sprinting towards us. And that's when I saw my brother, already sprinting away from this thing, whatever it was, completely petrified by what he had seen. And as we're both going as fast as we can back towards the truck, this thing is now picking up speed, tremendously. This thing stops, and we could hear it jump into the river and disappear. We run the entire way back to the truck, and we get to the truck, and we are exhausted, out of breath, and can hardly breathe. I start asking my brother, "What did you see? I mean, what was that?" He just kept shaking his head and his hands. We get in the truck, and right as about as he puts this thing in a drive, this same animal jumps out of the tree line and jumps onto the bed of my brother's truck. Not just jumping onto the bed, but jumping onto the rear left tire, biting onto it, tearing it, popping the whole thing. My brother floors it in a drive and does a very movie-style S-180, throwing this creature about 40 or so feet onto the gravel. And now, my brother's truck is facing this thing head-on, and my brother slams on the gas pedal, flooring it. My brother flies directly at this thing, going at least 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. This thing, in the right moment, jumps up, jumps onto the front of the truck, smashes part of the windshield in, and flies directly overhead. And in the process of doing all this, my brother really messed up his axle and part of his tires. And so he's flying out from this gravel road with this wolf thing running after us. His back tire is completely flat, and his windshield is smashed. Not completely shattered, by the way, but just smashed. And he's trying to go as fast as he can back to the main road, which is still a couple of miles away. And this massive wolf thing is now running right alongside the driver's side, keeping up in speed and pace, and rams itself against the truck as hard as it can. It nearly knocks the car over off the road into the trees. And my brother's trying to fight this thing, and so he sharply turns the wheel and tries to knock this wolf, but it jumps off into the trees. I was convinced that whatever animal this was, it wanted to eat us. We were going to die. And so we finally reached the end of the road without this thing taking off our truck, and we had to immediately pull over and call for assistance. The entire time we're sitting there completely shaken up over what had just happened. What were we going to tell people? Oh yeah, we went off-roading and got kinda crazy. That's pretty much what we had to tell the tow truck. We couldn't really give them a good explanation. Same thing with the sheriff. When he began asking us questions, he thought we had gotten drunk and driven into a tree. Or something. We weren't exactly sure what to tell him. I can't remember, I think we played it off as something stupid like that. But safe to say, we do not go back to that fishing spot anymore. That's a spot we're done with entirely. I was out during the day, and I heard a strange howl. It was off in the distance. I did not think much of it at first, but later on, around 1:45 a.m. or so, me and my girlfriend were laying in our bedroom, just relaxing. Our window is right next to our bed, so we can often see deer out by our deck. At this point, we could hear heavy footsteps pretty close to our cabin, as if whatever it was trying to sniff around and listen. This is the first time I have heard anything around our property, so naturally, we were a bit on edge. Just then, we see this big 7 to 8 foot tall dog-wolf creature sprinting through our yard across the street, opposite of the direction the howls earlier came from, running at full speed. It got to about 30 to 40 feet away from our cabin before it stopped, just standing there in the middle of the road, staring back at us for a minute. And I could clearly see that this was no ordinary dog. It had very lanky toned limbs and was very skinny, a very almost malnourished looking body. It appeared to have matted fur and looked very dirty and unkempt. After a minute or so, I felt like it was trying to get my attention because of the way it kept glancing back at our bedroom window. But every time we would start making direct eye contact with it, it would turn its head and stare out into the surrounding forest. This went on for a good while, until it felt like the creature had overall just lost interest in us, took off running down towards the barn nearby. The description of this thing was very similar to that of other stories I've heard from people around the area, who have claimed they too have seen a dogman. While I've heard of these stories, I've never been a believer until now, so I'm very interested to see if there are other people in my area who've spotted this thing too. My girlfriend and I are definitely carriers, and so we spent the rest of the night laying together in our bed, both of our guns locked and loaded. We were scared, but we were ready in case anything was about to unfold. My brother and I always spent a lot of time together out in the backwoods when we were much younger. When we were around 13 years old, we both saw something we simply can't explain to this day. My brother and I were walking through the woods for whatever reason. No specific destination in mind, just walking. Eventually, we come across a stretch of land that was a little more barren. It almost had an entirely flat surface, with only a few trees, which was very unusual in the forest we grew up in. We decided to use this to our advantage, being 13-year-old boys, and made a makeshift battlefield to do some sword fights with sticks. As we're doing this, we can hear something large begin to move towards us through the woods. We start by hearing branches busting and loud footsteps. Before we could even question what was going on, a tall, dog-like creature burst out of the woods and stopped about 10 feet from where we were standing. It looked like a tall, slender canine, having long black shaggy hair and this white stripe on its chest that was very visible, despite the dark color. It had pointy ears and a wide set of eyes that we could see very clearly from 10 feet away. Its nose and mouth looked like a dog's, but instead had teeth that were thin and jagged, fangs, reminding us similar to that of a shark, and its face seemed to have a lot less hair on it. My brother and I were completely frozen in fear at the time, and were ready to run, in case this thing decided to attack us or kill us. We said nothing, and waited for something to happen. But instead, this creature just stared at us with a blank expression, as if trying to decide what we were, or if we were a threat or not. Honestly, I think we surprised it by even being there. The way I remember it is that its expression and demeanor was very caught off guard, like it was on a mission to go somewhere, and here we are, just totally disrupting its mission, and now it wasn't sure what to do. So after about a minute or so of this weird standoff, it casually just kind of turned around and walked out into the forest, into another opening, after stopping right at the tree line, looking back at us a final time, hesitating, and then darting again, the same way it had come, disappearing for good. That whole day, my brother and I were on edge about what had happened that morning. We tried to decide to do some research online to see if there were maybe any reports of something similar having ever occurred in our area. Unfortunately, after an hour or so of searching, we couldn't really find much of anything. So eventually, over the years, it just became a distant memory, and a fear that faded away until now, when I'm almost back in my hometown for vacation. I was curious to see if maybe other residents had ever seen anything like this. Maybe something could have happened that led up to seeing this creature that day, or maybe that was just the only time it had managed to get close to civilization. So, I started searching again, and eventually came across an article about a local sighting here in Oklahoma, almost the exact spot where we saw this creature all those years ago. The similarities between what my brother and I had seen that day and what the other residents witnessed were simply astounding. They described something that looked like a combination of a wolf and a hyena. Its fur was described as dark, with white on its chest, pointed ears and black, thin jagged teeth and an open mouth, orange eyes, long thin legs, and human-like feet and hands. The creature was also described as having a very similar posture and movement to that of a human, like the way it moved its shoulders when it walked, and its gait, and even its movement. My brother and I have never seen another Dogman-like being since this one. But, in light of this new information, and all the videos you have on your channel, maybe it's time we do a little bit of educating. What do you think? Went on vacation with the wife back in 2008, towards San Diego. Had a nightmare instead. We were stargazing on a cliff, specifically in the Palomar Mountain State Park. Had just gotten settled down and was laying on my back, looking upwards at the stars for about 5 minutes, before I noticed something moving towards us from the distance. At first, I thought it was a helicopter, but as it got closer and more in the distance, there was no noise coming from it. As it got closer, it began to change shape, and the object moved from a kind of a helicopter shape to a triangular shape, and had this really dark underside with 3 white lights on each corner of the triangle. My wife and I were astonished, considering we were seeing a real-life UFO. It flew directly over our heads, probably no more than a few hundred feet above, heading off in the direction of San Diego. As soon as that happened, there was an immediate shift in the atmosphere around us. I say that because things immediately felt very unsettling. About 15 minutes afterwards, we're sitting there talking about it, how amazing the fact that we just saw a UFO that close, and we begin to hear growling sounds. The growling goes on for about 5 minutes, and my wife looks up and sees these red eyes peering at us, and can make out what looks to be a large dog. I'll skip to the good part. We both nope out of there, not wasting any more time. I don't know what that shape was above the sky, if it was aliens or a UFO or what, but it certainly brought some bad juju along with it. I saw something in the woods I just can't explain. I'm not normally the type of person to believe in such hocus-pocus paranormal stuff, but this is just so far out in left field for me. I still have a rough time really grasping it. I have no idea what I saw, but it's been running through my head ever since. It never left. I was camping outside 30 minutes, right outside of Grants Pass, Oregon, in the woods with a friend. We were sitting by the fire, drinking and smoking some weed. Our tents were set up on one side, and we had a small fire pit that we would sit around and talk. My friend got up to go drain the snake, and I sat there alone for a few minutes before deciding to stretch my legs. They were feeling a little cramped. I sat there alone and started to just ponder my life. So I got up, walked away from the camp, past where we had put our bikes up. It felt so good to be outside at night, with nothing but the stars above and all the trees around. I don't even know how it happened, but I saw something in front of me, and in an instant later, it was running on all fours. I don't know exactly how to put this into words or if I ever could, but I feel like it's burned into my head ever since this day. What I saw was a large canine, or should I say, a being that was completely wolf-like. It was on all fours, but its back was very parallel to the ground. Its fur color was light brown, and had very dark eyes. Its mouth was wide open, with its tongue kind of sticking out, the way a big dog's would. The only thing that made me feel remotely better was that it was not running in my direction, or appeared to have any intention to hurt me. It was completely silent after it disappeared. I realized that I had my rifle with me, which also had a flashlight attachment. I don't even remember grabbing it, but it's probably a good thing I did. Before this thing disappeared, it had looked at me for a few seconds before walking off behind some trees. I didn't feel the need to really chase after it, because where would it go? The whole thing happened so fast that if I took off running, it probably wouldn't have chased me anyway. I've never really had any interest in Sasquatch or Dogman ever before, but this seems like something worth looking into for sure. If you do, please let me know though. I didn't even bother telling my friend, who went off to go pee, what I saw. I didn't really feel it was worth it. And I've never told anybody about this before. I thought they would just say it's probably a dream. But now that I have looked into the Dogman stuff, I feel like this has happened for a reason. I would love to hear your thoughts. My grandmother used to always tell me about this creature when I was growing up. She said it would always try and stand in the middle of the road and make these awful screaming noises. My father even swears up and down that he saw one once, walking out around our window. I know they've been reported all over the United States, so it's certainly not just a Pacific Northwest thing. When I was little, my dad told me about one time in particular when he saw one in broad daylight. He said it was walking through the forest when spotted by his friend. It just froze mid-step and stared them down until they got so uncomfortable they had to leave. This thing held its ground. I know it sounds crazy, but I did some research a while back, and there's actual reports of going crazy. I grew up in a tiny little southern town in Oregon called Tribby. Nothing ever really happened there, although we did have one incident with this weird-looking wolf thing back in the late 80s. Many people thought it was probably a werewolf. Most people would have probably laughed at me if I ever told them this story, but my dad was very adamant that it really did happen. It all started on a weekend getaway with his friends out to the forest, just east of town. They had been hunting for bear or deer most of the day, but had no luck. They decided to pack up their gear and head out for the evening when one of his friends spotted something in the distance. It was very tall, maybe about 7 or so feet, covered in thick black fur. It was walking upright like a man. My dad said they watched it for a while before it spotted them. It stopped, stared at them for a minute, and then seemed to just shrink down, almost like it was feigning death. Then quickly shot up and took off running on all fours across this field, roughly 125 yards away. My dad says it moved so very fast out of sight before his friend had a chance to pull out his rifle. Now, my dad and his friends didn't talk very much about this after. However, something had happened to my uncle just a few months later. He was out in the forest alone one day when he came across this dog-like creature out in the middle of a small creek or riverbed. My uncle claims that it looked injured, but when he approached it out of curiosity, it was a trap. It stood up on its hind legs and roughly almost attacked him. My uncle, spooked, completely ran off. We really don't know what he saw or what it could have been, but they all seem completely terrified every time we bring this up. And even my dad's friend swears up and down that he saw one in the middle of the highway back when they were in high school. He claims it was standing right in the center of the lane, having piercing yellow eyes glaring in the headlights. He came around a corner, probably doing about 45 miles an hour, on this old logging road when he saw it. managed to just barely miss it by swerving off, heading almost into a ditch. And my dad never actually believed him until him and my uncle spotted one a little later. But the older I've gotten, I've become more into cryptids and the paranormal. In fact, I try to educate myself a lot and really study and learn about Dogman. From what I can tell, people have really been reporting a lot about them, a lot more than you would know. And I know that they're not native to America. In fact, there's even reports of them in the UK, France, Germany, Russia, even South America. So if you think you're all alone, at night out in the woods, guess again. I was out in my field late one night, when suddenly, I heard a sound coming from the brush. It sounded like an animal of some sort, but it wasn't making any other noises. Now, this went on for about 10 seconds, until I finally saw that it was a canid. Except, I've seen dogs and wolves, and all sorts of canids. This was nothing like I'd ever seen before in my life. It had long dark hair, and walked upright, with its head down, and arms by its sides. My heart began beating really fast. This thing looked like it wanted to hurt me, or something. So I ran back to my house as fast as possible, without ever looking back once. It was the next day when I saw him again. I was laying in bed, and out of nowhere, I see this face through the window. It scared me so bad I jumped off the bed, tried to run, but my body wouldn't let me. An expression came over its face that seemed to say something like, "Don't," or "Don't scream." But those are just guesses, because I couldn't hear anything. It then backed away and disappeared into the trees that are right by my window. I have never been so terrified in my life. The animal I encountered that night was not like any canid I have ever seen before, and I've been around wild dogs, coyotes, wolves, you name it. There's no telling what kind of monster this is or what it's truly capable of. I found out that he was spotted not too far from my house, and I've been hearing about the goings-on around here for a while now. There's no telling how many of these things are running loose, or, again, what they're truly capable of. There's one thing I know for sure, though. It won't make my mind any easier to know I'm alive to see another day. As far as I'm concerned, it's another day, another possibility to see one of these things. I first heard about Dogman when I was only a teenager. This is the story of a friend of mine, who, we'll call him David. One night, he was driving home late from work on some county road in northern Indiana where he lived. He saw something out of the corner of his eye on a lone road. This road was surrounded by cornfields on all sides. I have David's full permission to share this story with you. He says this in verbatim. I then pulled over to smoke a cigarette, and while I was sitting there on the side of the road, this large canine walks out of the cornfield. It was maybe 7 feet tall to the shoulders, and had thick hair all over its body. It was kind of this weird human-looking head. It stopped in front of me, stood there for a minute, before turning around and walking back off into the corn. The whole time I'm just staring at this thing, and it's staring right back at me. It's not like I saw an animal running down the side of a highway or anything like that. It just seemed really deliberate. David said his mouth was bone dry by the time the encounter had ended. He got out of there as fast as he could, and didn't tell anyone about it until a little later. He'd seen a movie on television that featured the creature in an episode of Monster Quest. David told me this. I kept thinking about what I saw when I watched the show, so I decided to tell a couple of friends at work. They thought I was messing with them, so one night, when there was nothing better to do, we took that same cornfield road out near where all this happened, and we sat there in my car, waiting for something to happen. We didn't really expect anything to, though. We were all completely sober, and so we sat there. Again, no drugs or alcohol involved whatsoever. David said it began to get dark, and visibility began to go down as they sat there on the road. At one point, he made a comment to his friends that they may be waiting out there all night for nothing. And that's when something began running down the road toward them. I couldn't really make it out, David said, but I knew that whatever it was that my eyes were seeing, it was in no way natural. It came closer and closer to our car until I could make out what it was. It looked like a wolf, kind of like what I saw before, but a little different. It's weird looking. The body looked far more human. That's when I knew something wasn't right. My friend and I just sat there for a minute, being in complete shock after we see this thing run past our car. So I started the car back up and got out of there as fast as I could. Now, David told me that it took him a while to get back into his normal routine after what had happened that night. But by the next day at work, he said he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. He even said that it wasn't until after he saw the Monster Quest. He said that it wasn't until after he saw the Monster Quest episode that he realized it was not a ghost or a werewolf, but some kind of dog cryptid. David went on to say, after I got over the initial shock, I began to research more on the internet for more information about this thing I'd seen. It wasn't long before I found out that a lot of other people had witnessed similar creatures in many different states around the country. I then began telling my friends and family about what happened, so they could see I wasn't lying or pulling their leg. The friends that I'd seen this creature, they were so freaked out, they refused to go back to that spot. I was still desperate to get answers. I really wanted to know what this creature was. I've tried looking for it again and again, but I have yet to see anything. It's like it just disappeared from the face of the earth. Now, David went on to tell me that he's not sure what kind of dogman he saw that night. The only reason he even believes it was a dogman is because the creature he saw looked extremely canine, and after researching, those are the only two dots he could really connect. David went on to say, I'm not too sure what kind of dog or dogman it could have been. The only reason I say this is because it moved so fast with such powerful agility that it hardly seemed like a wolf or anything else, not to mention the fact that it looked extremely humanoid. That in of itself was very off-putting for all of us that witnessed this creature. I've been trying to wrap my head around it ever since. I still really want to know what it is, where it came from, and if there are other creatures like this one out there. David told me that he's not sure if he'll ever see this creature again or not, although he hasn't seen it in over a year. He said that he still thinks about it often. He's not sure if it just moved on to another area or if it died. I've even gone back to the spot where I saw this thing to see if there were any possible way of telling what direction it's coming from, but I'm always far too afraid to investigate further. I'm sure if I did, it would come back for more. I know that you probably don't believe me, but what I saw in that field was definitely out of the ordinary. It may sound crazy to most, and that's okay with me because no one has ever believed my stories anyway. But I have to say that I've never been so scared, especially when this thing revealed itself. I would like to have more information about this creature, and strangely enough, I can't seem to find any real evidence or information other than different and various encounters and stories. I'm hoping you'll be able to help me and David achieve some answers. I'm not sure why or how you're into this stuff, but I really appreciate all of your help with this matter. And by the way, sorry for the confusing formatting. Hopefully you can discern which quotes are me and David. I would also like to know if there are any other people out there that have had similar experiences and information. I told David that if I find anything else about Dogman, I will get back to him as soon as possible. Thank you, and for anybody that hears this, for being such a great resource. I had a terrifying fishing trip when I was just a boy. I had been fishing with my dad for about 2 hours. It was just me and him in the boat. We were out on a clear lake, so it wasn't hard to see anything across the water. As we're driving around in the boat, he pointed and said, "Do you see that large dog over there on the shore?" We looked, and what he was pointing at appeared to be this large canine sitting down by some tree. You could tell it was too short to be a human because of the way it sat. It was crouched over like a dog or something. And when I saw it, I thought, wow, a German Shepherd. I said to my dad, although maybe it's actually kind of bigger than what I thought. So we turned the boat to get a closer look at it. And that's when we can both tell this was not a normal dog. Then, as we're observing it, it stands up on 2 legs and begins moving backwards into the trees. I yelled to my dad to quickly turn the boat around. I was afraid this dog would come after us. He said he couldn't tell what kind of canine this was and that he wanted to get a much better look. So he kept driving up to it, but we could both tell it wasn't normal. It was like a 6-foot-tall, lanky brownish-reddish color, sharp teeth, long, gangly limbs. My dad got as close as maybe about 100 feet before he turned back around when he saw it stand up on 2 legs and slowly move backwards into the trees. As we pulled away from the shoreline, all of a sudden, this creature came out of the trees and dove into the water after us. We were completely panicked. This thing was so large and fast. I turned my attention back to the shoreline, and I saw this brownish-reddish creature with very long gangly limbs come out of the trees, diving in the water. My dad was panicking from seeing this thing, and it was coming fast. We were scared it was going to emerge and try to capsize our boat, so we began going as fast as possible. We had to row. The engine stopped working. Of course, it's like we were caught in some sort of cliché horror movie. I thought this thing was about to jump into the boat, but it disappeared, because when I turned to look, it had completely went under. I thought it could have been lurking below us and surfaced from behind our boat, but as I continued to look around, nothing. This thing had been nothing but incredibly hostile and dangerous. Fortunately, we were successful in fleeing without it ever attacking our boat. Now, when we got home, he called up his friend who is a biologist. We asked him if there was any animals that were like this in our area. His friend said no such animals existed, but that you would never see one in an open area anyway. If they did, they would probably tend to live in forests or swamps. I've never seen this creature before. I don't know what it is. This thing looked really scary. I have no idea what kind of creature this could have been. I know wolves have been spotted in this area, but this didn't match any description of a wolf I'd ever seen or heard of in my life. It appeared to be far more human than wolf, in my opinion. I'm not saying werewolf. I don't believe those exist. However, this was something far more than just an animal. Any ideas what you think my father and I encountered that day? This happened sometime in October of 2007. My wife and I were driving down a dark road that night. We had been out doing some errands, and we decided to go take a little look at the lake that's south of us here in West Ohio. The area has always been beautiful, but as you drive back into it from the main roads around the highway this time of year, all the trees are normally bare by now. We've noticed for many years that the dogwoods are usually still in full bloom this time, but just a few days before we were out, about 9:30 p.m. or so. Driving down the road, I noticed something crossing the road quickly to my right side. It was already beginning to get dark out and had been raining more than normal around here lately, but I could clearly see what looked like a giant dog on two legs crossing the road from our left to our right as we drove along slowly, looking at all the lakes along the way. I was kind of shocked, but kept driving, with my head turned over there, where I thought I saw whatever it was crossing. My wife had asked me what was wrong. I told her I thought I just saw something cross the road back there. She asked me what it was. I don't want to sound crazy or anything, but all of a sudden, we both heard this deep growling coming from the woods that was directly off to our left side and in front of us where she had been and seen whatever crossed the road just now. My wife looked over at me with shock on her face and asked me, "Did you hear that?" As we continued driving slowly along, whatever was making the noises ran out into the middle of the road right in front of us, and when it got close enough for us to see clearly, we realized it wasn't human. It stopped dead still in front of my car, as if it was waiting on us to do something. Then, it just turned around and ran back into the woods, about 100 or so yards. I remember thinking that my brakes weren't even on, but we had not moved. It was like in a movie or something, because you know how they're always dragging their feet in those movies. Well, this thing was standing still, at least for a few seconds, while we were driving slowly right along next to it. Knowing that most encounters with these things are not very pleasant, I decided to pull over and make sure nothing else followed our first guest out of the woods and into the road. After driving down a little further, I pull off onto a gravel road and parked up against some trees. We waited there for maybe 30 minutes before venturing out any further. I know, it sounds absolutely insane to the sane human being. Why would anybody hang around after seeing something like that? To be real, I can't tell you why. Fear will make you do crazy things. Fear rewires your brain to almost a primitive level. I just knew that whatever it was, what we saw, it couldn't allow it to follow us home. My wife was pregnant with our third child, and I felt if it came to a fight, me, myself, whatever, could handle walking back to the woods after whatever it was. It was my family that worried me. What would this thing do to them? We both know that we had no choice but to try and get home as safely as possible. So we did. After waiting for what seemed like forever, the only sounds we heard were those of crickets, which seemed to now be coming back after being completely silent for a while. Frogs were now croaking, and a few birds flying past in the distance from time to time. With nothing bad happening during our waiting period, I decided to make my way back up to the road where the car was parked. As I scrambled up to the gravel road where I stopped the car initially and parked, my wife stayed put and watched me go. Once on the top of the small hill in front of our location, I was able to successfully see down into the woods a bit further than before. Standing there, about 200 yards or so away from the car, we saw at first what looked like one dog, standing still, waiting for us to do something again. After watching it for a few seconds, I realized it wasn't just one, but several of them, huddled together, as if they were cold or scared, standing there among the trees. It was like they were talking with each other, trying to decide what they were going to do next, knowing that if we were to walk back to the woods, after whatever it was, we would certainly be picked off, one at a time. I decided that it might be in my best interest to just stay in my car and drive out as fast as I could. We drove out until we hit the paved road again, and once we stopped, this time though, instead of parking in the middle of the road or against a tree up against some bushes somewhere, we parked kind of right at an intersection with no traffic. I figured this way, if something decided to try and follow us or attack us from behind on these dark country roads, it would give them virtually nowhere to hide. We still didn't see anything else move on the whole ride home, except for what looked like 4 to 5 dogs running through the wild grass on the side. I do remember having a rather vivid dream once we escaped and got home. Though I can't say for sure if it was a dream or not. It was one of those that seemed so real. I was standing there in our front yard, looking back down this dirt road that leads to our house. And there, standing with its front paws outstretched on either sides of me, was this thing. It was around 8 feet tall and on 2 legs, leaning over me and deciding what to do next, like a cat that had just caught a mouse, trying to determine how to kill a prey. The scariest part about this whole thing, though, was not just seeing it standing there in front of me. No. What scared me more than anything else was looking across at my wife, who was standing there, watching as this thing stared down at me, completely vulnerable and in its grasp. She stood there watching, thinking, okay, my husband at any point is going to get us out of this. I didn't know how right she was at that moment, though, because the fact is, I'm not sure if we could have gotten out, even if I had tried. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying here, though. The Dogman encounter that my wife and I had with each other wasn't the worst one you're ever going to read about on your search for encounters or anything. In fact, a lot of people who have seen these things aren't really worried about being attacked. They're more scared of what they may do to their dogs, or worse. It seems like a lot of people who have had experiences with these things are farmers, or even small business owners in rural areas, where they stand guard over farms, ranches, and homes. Some say they attack your pets if you do not feed them. Others say that they purposefully leave dead deer carcasses on properties at night, as if some kind of warning to keep people away from their territory, while others fear for their lives around this thing. It's mainly kept as stealing livestock like chickens and goats, only leaving behind bones and blood. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. It's getting long. I hope you and your website can help us get the word out that these things can be dealt with before they do something worse than tear open some poor dog for no reason. I've been trying to find someone who could help maybe get me in touch with the right people, make sure this thing isn't still out there, doing whatever it wants to. I'm not talking about an interview or anything like that, but just a way to make sure it won't come back. You know what I mean? Just so you know. We did go back once about 3 months after our first encounter. Found nothing. No tracks or broken branches anywhere. Where we saw this creature before, there was no trace of it. Even if we found something, still, it perplexed us. It took us weeks after our encounter just to talk about what had happened, and my wife still likes to joke with me, sometimes saying, hey, you never know. We might get another Dogman visit sometime in the future. What she doesn't understand is that this isn't a joking matter at all for me. That's why I'm hoping somebody can help us out here. Somebody, at least to try and make it more dealable. That's why I'm hoping somebody can do something. More than a year later, it still creeps into my mind at the most random times. I hope you can understand, even if this does come off as incoherent rambling. I grew up in a small town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's a very rural area with lots of woods and forests. I never really had any weird experiences until one day when I was 17 years old. My friends and I were driving around, looking for some places to go swimming. We ended up at this abandoned cement factory that was sitting right at the edge of town. The whole thing is surrounded by trees and bushes, so it kind of feels like you're out in the middle of nowhere, even though it's only about 10 minutes outside of town. Anyway, afterwards, I ended up working my shift, which took me really late at night. This is where my story begins. It was a dark night, and I had just driven home from work. As I drove down the long, winding road that leads to my house, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. It looked like an animal of some kind, but it was hard to tell exactly. I mean, there were no streetlights back there. And suddenly, this creature jumped out at me from the trees on either side of the narrow dirt lane. It swiped at my car with its sharp claws, nearly knocking my vehicle off balance with its weight, before disappearing into the woods once more. All I could see for a moment was its glowing eyes, before they blinked out too quickly for me to focus on them any longer. I sped up, and it was now running behind my car, growling the whole time. Once I reached the turnoff that would lead me past the security gate into my house, I floored it. The creature scampered off into the woods, and I stopped seeing it. I couldn't get over how my whole body shook when I saw it lunge at me before jumping back. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel my pulse in my neck. It was so dark that it was all I could do to keep the last glimpse of its glowing eyes imprinted on my memory. I feel like I would never forget those eyes, and the feeling of terror they provoked. I knew about the Dogman before I ever saw it. I had always been part of my family's history, passed down in story from generation to generation. We all grew up hearing the stories from our elders, and as a child, they were just scary stories to tell on a cold winter's night around the fire with hot apple cider in hand. As you get older, though, you come to understand that some of what they're telling, take it for what it is, a cautionary tale. I don't care if you believe me when I say that I saw the Dogman. It made my whole body shake. All I could see were its eyes, which were like a dull glow in the dark, before it disappeared into the woods again. It was hard to make out anything else, but the creature, again, it was very dark. But I know what I saw and felt. When it lunged at me and jumped back, I had never been more scared in my entire life. I grew up in Washington State and have lived there my whole life. Washington is a beautiful state with so much to offer. The mountains, the ocean, rainforests, deserts. The list goes on. I've been lucky enough to explore this amazing place for most of my life, and now that I'm all grown up and ready to start making some decisions about where I want to live permanently, it's a good time to reflect back on what has made me fall in love with Washington. It's such an incredible place, full of beauty and wonder. I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. One of my best friends and I decided to go camping in the mountains one summer night. We got a lake, so it was pretty dark by the time we made it to our campsite, which was on the other side of this lake. As soon as we set up camp and began cooking dinner, we heard what sounded like a howling, but coming from across the river. We didn't think much of it until we saw what looked like a huge dog loping around the trees out there, and it was coming towards us. I swear, friend, that this thing had glowing eyes, 2 big orange circles, looking right at me. It then quickly disappeared, and we didn't see it for a while after that. But shortly later, we heard some more noises in the distance. Again, it sounded like a large animal running through the woods. After a few moments, we all began hearing twigs snapping and what sounded like something coming close to our campsite. We all became really scared, trying to have a sense of humor about it. But then we saw something standing next to our tent. It was around 6 foot tall on 4 legs, with a shaggy, wolf-like head and fur. The creature ran off into the forest before my friend or I could get a better look at it. It was the scariest thing I've ever experienced. Not only did I feel we were going to die, but I couldn't sleep for a long time after. My mind was racing with thoughts of what could have been out there, watching us, waiting. I mean, I've heard of Bigfoot, but this was a creature I never even imagined even existed before. I'm not much of a believer in Bigfoot, but after this sighting, maybe they do exist out there. Maybe other animals like it exist too. The creature really reminded me of a werewolf, even though werewolves don't exist. Even though the word werewolf doesn't really describe what we saw that night, they actually look more like werewolves. I know, a lot of Native American tribes have legends about something they call the Dogman, so maybe it's connected to that. Or maybe they are just animals out there like him, and we don't really know much about them. I've tried doing some research before shooting you this email, but I've only been successful with finding little details. A lot of the stories out there are pretty old, and only include a few details, or they're accompanied by blurry photographs. I'm really interested in finding out more about this creature or Dogman, so I can feel better after my encounter with whatever it was that night. What do you know about them? Anything might help. Your best guess would be a good place to start. Thanks for your time, friend. I'm not sure what is scarier, the stories of people who have seen it, or the fact that I now live in fear of being one of them. The Dogman has been sighting in numerous states throughout North America, and more recently, sightings have been reported near my hometown. It's being described as a werewolf-like creature, about 8 feet tall, amber-colored glowing eyes, and gray to black fur covering its body. This thing sounds terrifying. While I haven't seen one myself, I'm reaching out to you today to share with you my aunt's first-hand encounter she experienced just last summer. In her words, I was driving out my car around early one morning. There were some deer in the road. I slowed down to help them cross. As soon as they cleared the street, I looked ahead and saw a large gray animal come into view. It appeared to be running on 2 legs, and it cleared the road quickly. Then, it turned its head to look back at me. It was this time I noticed it had glowing amber eyes. I lost control of the car in my shock, and luckily was already slowed down. I was so frightened, I lost consciousness for a brief time, until I woke up to find my vehicle badly damaged. After she came to, she found her bumper ripped off and her front end damaged. She also said that there were deep claw marks along the sides of her vehicle. While some may think this sounds like a miscellaneous animal attack, many more are convinced this is the work of a Dogman or cryptid of some kind. Similar characteristics, of course. They believe these types of attacks have been happening for a long time, all over North America, but most have just never been reported. It would be nice to hear from others who may have either had similar encounters or know more about the habits of Dogmen. Obviously, this left my aunt completely terrified and shaken up. I'm not sure why this creature can't seem to figure out what it wants to do. My aunt says she was unconscious for a brief time after she saw this creature. She woke up to find her car damaged with deep claw marks on the side of the vehicle. One moment, it's breaking into cars and killing people, but now it seems to be more interested in just running them off the road, giving them a warning. It's confusing. It had a perfectly golden opportunity to kill my aunt, but it didn't. Why did it damage the car for? I mean, due to the severity of the damage, it's only natural to assume it was caused by this creature. Anyway, you're the expert here. What are your thoughts on this crazy story? By the way, I 100% believe my aunt. She is very truthful and never really ever makes up stories. She's a very honest person. This was the first time that she had seen this Dogman, but she is certain it was the creature. For one thing, she was completely conscious when the sighting occurred. Also, several other people have reported seeing this Dogman over the past few years. It's been seen in a number of locations all across the country, and most recently, reports are coming out of Michigan. Based on my research, I've found that many people who report encounters with this creature often give very accurate descriptions of it. They also tend to describe how it specifically targets humans. I'm not sure if you're aware, but there have been numerous attacks where the perpetrator has claimed to be the Dogman. This is especially true when dogs are involved, as it seems like the Dogman takes great pleasure in chasing them down before ripping them apart. These creatures are far more volatile than bears. Anyway, get back to me. Let me know what you think of her story. Thank you for taking your time. It's a very common myth that people who have seen the Dogman are considered crazy. However, it's not always easy to tell what's real and what isn't anymore. People are seeing things all around the country, now with their own eyes more than ever. So, there must be something to the story. It might sound unbelievable at first, but you can't deny these stories when they're coming from such reliable sources. There were even sightings recorded by a police officer back in 2010 and in 2013. An American Indian tribe had multiple reports of being chased by this large wolf-like creature. What do you think? My grandmother was also an American Indian who belonged to the same tribe. For reasons I'm not going to name the tribe. She and many of the fellow tribesmen saw the same strange wolf-like creature during their hunting trips at nighttime. Their claim was that this animal was roughly 9 feet tall, walked around on 4 legs, and had a face like a fierce wolf with glowing red eyes. It seemed to be stalking them, and they ran as fast as they could to get back to their camp. The next day, when they looked for tracks, they found nothing, but it still gave them goosebumps every time they told their stories. Another story from my grandmother back in the day tells of a disturbing find. 2 young boys who had seen something big and upright in the woods at night. They stumbled out into their front lawn, told their parents about it. The next day, they took their dad back to the place where they saw it, and he discovered an 18-inch long paw print. Something was out there watching them, but what? Then, there was a younger couple, a boyfriend-girlfriend, who reported seeing something like a werewolf coming out of the forest towards them, and it began to growl. They ran inside, but this thing had pressed its face up against their window, watching them for a while. They described it as really scary and grotesque looking. I talked to a few people who live in or around the Manistee area, and they said they've seen things like this before. One of them was an officer who caught something on video camera not long ago, but never made it public. There is another man from North Carolina whose father was also a policeman there. He informed me that his father had a close encounter at nighttime with this strange wolf creature back in 1979, and even now, after so many years have passed, he still gets nervous when it comes to talking about what happened. He said that his father was driving home late one night when he saw a tall figure standing on 2 legs besides the road ahead of him. He pulled over, being curious, but suddenly, this creature dropped down on all 4s, running into the woods. He said its fur covered its entire body, which was brown-reddish, a very wolfish face, glowing eyes, and stood roughly 9 to 10 feet tall, a behemoth of a creature. I think there is definitely something going on here. What are your thoughts?